I thought a quite astonishing summit. The G7 summit was held in Japan over the weekend. It's wrapped up. Joe Biden's flown back, I understand, to the United States of America. He was meant to be going to the US Pacific sort of summit that Chris Hipkins is at in Papua New Guinea. I can imagine better places to hold a summit. I suppose it doesn't matter if you're the Prime Minister of New Zealand, but if you've ever been to PNG, yeah, it's sort of there. Yeah, anyhow, cut a long story short. But he's not there, Joe Biden, so Chris Hipkins won't be meeting him. He's had to fly back to Washington. But it was a fascinating G7, so fascinating in so many ways. President Zelensky from Ukraine was there. He's he's certainly flavour of the media and the Western media at the moment, but he wouldn't be anywhere else, I imagine. And there were some fascinating themes came out of the G7 to talk about that, but also the general international situation and, what seems to be warming up this new Cold War is Professor Robert Patman, the outstanding Otago University professor of foreign affairs. Politics, but he specialises in foreign relations and foreign affairs, and he joins us now. Robert, good morning to you. Lovely to have you on the show again.
Good morning, Michael. It's a pleasure to be with you.
You are a very clever man, Robert, but can I just say, as you talk to your political science students this morning or sometime this week, do you look at the world at the moment and go, kids, you're in for a really interesting adulthood?
It's interesting but scary.
It is.
But it's signs of alarm and hope. We've got the worst war in Europe since the Second World War with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And we've got growing Chinese assertiveness in the Indo-Pacific. And we've also got growing US-China rivalry. So there are some points of tension around against that. And this is where I'm pleased that you mentioned the young kids at university because they've got a role to play. The problems that the world now faces, including all superpowers, small powers and middle powers, none of these problems can be solved unilaterally or great powers acting alone. I mean, we're talking about problems like climate change, like transnational terrorism, problems of the greater economy. None of these problems, Michael, actually respect borders. So, in a sense, that may be a long-term sign of hope because it may mean the middle powers and the smaller powers, by definition, have to be part of the solution, and therefore they have some opportunity to influence events in a way they didn't in the past.
Yeah, I guess what I'm thinking is that I'm watching something that happened in my childhood and adolescence and now possibly yours as well. And that was, I grew up in a Cold War. China was always sort of isolated over there. They were always threatening Taiwan, even going back to the 1970s. But the world was often sketched in the place of, do you sign up with the Soviet bloc or with the American bloc? And you sort of ended up choosing sides. I'm sort of getting that feeling again, where you're choosing sides and that bloc isn't Soviet anymore. It's led by the Chinese, but it does include Russia and Brazil, obviously, possibly South Africa, definitely South Africa, actually, maybe India, who are sort of playing a long game here. You seem to have to choose sides just at the moment, Robert.
Oh, I think appearances can be deceptive, Michael. I don't think we're in a new Cold War. The world in the 21st century is completely different from the bifurcated or divided world of the Cold War era. What I mean by that is that when the Cold War was on, you basically had two comparable military alliances, each led by one superpower of the time, the United States and the Soviet Union. Also, there was no such thing as a global economy because there was essentially the Western-led economy or the US-led economy, the so-called global economy, and also the Soviet bloc economy. And there was very little interaction between them. And what we now have is the rise of a superpower, a second superpower, Communist China, which has risen mainly and almost exclusively because of its participation in a world capitalist or global market economy.
Yeah, that's the irony.
Well, it's not only an irony, it's a weakness for China, because people keep talking about China displacing the United States. China's export strategy is geared to servicing the US market and the EU market. And, this is... so that's one thing. I mean, China's... its rise has been impressive. No one can take that away from it. But it is deeply enmeshed in the existing global market economy. And China ultimately does know what side its bread is buttered. It knows that if it does anything to jeopardize access to export markets like the US or the EU or Japan, that could have very nasty ramifications for the political leadership, which has been able to deliver economic growth at home. So, I don't think we're in a new Cold War, but we certainly are in a situation where we've got two superpowers vying for dominance in a world they can't really control.
Well, let's look at the G7 communique that came out of Japan over the weekend, Robert, and that is it really, in a way, using language that I have not seen before or heard before, really barreled China and suggested that it was not playing the good corporate citizen. Now, in the past, it's tiptoed around that, but this time I felt they got, if not both barrels, then certainly the line was pointed to them and the warning shot was fired.
Yeah, I think there is a cumulative realization that hopes of liberalizing China by allowing it to participate in the global market economy, as we've just got mentioned, the West has played a key role in the rise of China, and no one should be any illusions about that. China did not rise to superpower status all on its own. It did it because it got access to big markets. I think what's happened is that the honeymoon period is over. There's no prospect of any movement towards liberalisation. The hope was, amongst many Western countries, by, I think, giving China a big role in the contemporary world, that China would liberalise. But it's not liberalising. Not only that, it backed, or at least tacitly supported, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And I think it's being pointed out to China, you can't have your cake and eat it. You can't expect to have access to global markets, enjoy economic growth, and back a country which has just ripped up the international rule book. And I think it's important that the Chinese leadership get clarity, and I think the G7 have delivered that. They've also given a very strong statement of support, not just in name, but in promises of actual substantial support to President Zelensky.
Yes, I'll come to that in just a second. The other thing that came out of G7 for me, or at least it was interesting, the hosts, is the militarization of Japan. Since the Second World War, very much like Western Germany and now Germany, there was a revulsion amongst the Japanese people, particularly when they looked at the wreckage of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, at how they'd got to that point. And I won't say a pacifism, because Japan's always had military forces, but a reluctance, even though it was very much part of the Western orbit, to get involved militarily in alliances. That seems to be now ebbing away, as in Germany, Robert. And the Japanese now appear to be coming to the view that they do have to side up with the United States, at least in a military context.
Yeah, I think you're right. But I think actually it's not just, the United States. I think there's a recognition by countries like Germany and Japan that they're powerful, they've got powerful economies, and they've got to take up their share of international responsibility. And I think Japan and Germany both had troubled past, and they've taken a while to come to terms with that, and for others to come to terms with that. But I think with China's rise, I think Japan realizes that it can't afford not to be in a position where it can defend its interests. Because Japan is the third world's largest economy. It's got a crucial role to play. It's a democracy. And I think a number of countries, not least New Zealand, have been urging Japan to become more active multilaterally in diplomatic terms. And of course, a more active diplomatic role is often effectively underpinned by more robust military capabilities. Not always, but it can be. So I think what we're witnessing here is a long-term progression from being a bit of a pariah state, but and it hasn't had that status for a long time, obviously, but immediately after the Second World War, Japan and Germany were somewhat under a cloud, but I think both have worked hard to overcome this. And Japan in particular is an important partner for New Zealand going forward. I know it's one of the countries that New Zealand would really like to develop its relationship with. It certainly, we as a country, New Zealand is seeking to reduce its trade dependence on China. Japan's an important country in that respect. And also, of course, we're looking to other countries like Thailand and Indonesia. Countries in the region, it's a dynamic region. There's plenty of good economies. And I think New Zealand sees Japan's progression internationally as a healthy thing and something that is very much in our interest.
The other thing that, I've only caught up with this in the last 24 hours. So I've just read the State Department's the US State Department's take on this issue. But that is that the United States is obviously seeking to increase its military presence in Papua New Guinea. How do you read that, Robert? I mean, that's a fascinating development to me.
Yes, it is interesting. I think the Americans would say, not publicly but privately, this is a response to China's growing role in the Pacific Island states, particularly the security agreement that China signed with the Solomons. I think there's a danger here that many of the Pacific Island states, and I think also Australia and New Zealand, don't want to see the region militarized. This is we don't exactly know the detail yet, but it would appear this agreement between the United States and Papua New Guinea is pretty extensive. It gives the United States almost unfettered access to Papua New Guinea for security purposes. And what we do not want is China to respond in turn, so that we get a sort of a mini great power competition unfolding. I mean, I know there's great power competition, and in a sense, from the point of view of Pacific Island states, that's not a bad thing because it means that they can play one against the other. But it's interesting, and I was carefully looking out for Chris Hipkins' reaction to this. He hasn't given us, he said that he doesn't want to see the militarization of the region. But let's just see. The agreement, as far as I know, hasn't been signed yet. It's been mooted and agreed in principle. But it is an interesting development, and it shows that the United States really does take the Chinese challenge in the Pacific Island states very seriously indeed.
Yes, and the other thing is I was also thinking this is good for Papua New Guinea too. I mean, if you can get people coming in, particularly the Americans, you can do two things. One, it's an economic boom. But the second is Papua New Guinea, and I'm unfortunate, but it's true. It is a very unstable domestic situation. And expats from New Zealand, Australia who go there, the United States is just about to find out, it ain't a safe place, Port Moresby. Do they think that might, and I see that they're actually going to be offering some assistance around policing. Do you think that's self-preservation from the American point of view, or that's something that the Papua New Guineans have asked for?
I'm sure the Americans have got pretty good intelligence about the situation in Papua New Guinea.
I'm sure, yeah.
And I think the Americans do tend, when they establish a military base, to make a mini America within that base.
Spot on.
They provide all the facilities that they normally have in the US, whether it be the brand takeaways, etc. So that may be part and parcel of America establishing a security facility in a faraway place from the US. I'm not sure they're taking special security precautions. I think they're pretty well informed, and I think they are risk averse anyway, the Americans, in the way they deal with situations where they have a military commitment. So, yeah, I mean, it's possible they are taking one or two extra precautions, but I think from what you've just said, it would seem that it's very much the standard American approach.
And finally, the Wagnerian forces have suggested that they've got Bakhmut. I have to say that the denials of the Ukrainians that don't ring particularly strong. They say that they've still got some buildings under their control, which isn't really, we've resisted them. Now, Zelensky's headed off, obviously, GC to try and summon more military assistance and aid. Obviously, the big decision last week was around the F-16s and the Americans saying that their allies can supply the Ukraine with them. You know what strikes me, Robert? I was just thinking last night, and unfortunately about 2 o'clock in the morning, God, you must have these thoughts sometimes too, and that is, I was thinking, God, I can probably write off all the things that the European community, the Americans, said they wouldn't provide the Ukraine. First of all, they weren't going to provide them with tanks or heavy weapons. They weren't going to provide them with long-range rocket capability. Well, they provided them with HIMARS. The tanks are going there. They weren't going to provide them with the Patriot anti-aircraft system, but that's gone there. And they weren't going to provide them with F-16s, and now that's gone there. You'd have to say, Zelensky must be saying, why didn't you give us this a year ago?
Yes, and there's been a lot of criticisms within Washington and outside Washington that America has been far too deferential, or far too measured is probably a better way of putting it, in response to Mr. Putin's repeated threats to use nuclear weapons. That if the West gave Ukraine the sort of assistance it needs to resist the invasion, he might consider escalating further. I think the Americans have taken a gradualist approach, as your words indicate quite accurately. It's been a gradual build-up. But the Americans, the Biden administration, say, well, actually, the Russians have taken, they've borne terrible costs, and the Ukrainians have demonstrated they're very militarily competent and, able to use the investment that the West is able to provide. But I do think the F-16s is a significant improvement in the capabilities that the Ukrainians have. And you're quite right, they seem to have lost Bakhmut. But what's interesting, the Ukrainians have gained about 20 kilometers along the flanks of Bakhmut. So I'm not quite sure what is going on there. I don't think the picture for Mr. Putin's army is good going forward, simply because they don't seem to be able to eradicate deep problems with communications within the Russian army, and also the supply lines look shaky. So the other thing is that the Ukrainians are getting really good weaponry, such as the Storm Shadow missile, which gives them a new extended range. And that's already taking a toll. Hardly a night goes by now without some sort of activity actually in Russia itself, some sort of burning buildings or activity. And I think that may be partisans acting, but I think the situation facing Mr. Putin is going to be quite grim in the next few months. And yes, they have taken Bakhmut, it would appear, but at enormous cost. Probably it's cost them somewhere between 20 and 30,000 troops. So that's a tremendous effort expended over 8 months for what many strategic analysts believe is not a city of great strategic value, but it's certainly of symbolic value, and it will give the Russians a boost because, let's face it, since they lost Kherson and Kharkiv latter end of 2022, the much vaunted Russian offensive hasn't really had many gains.
No, it has not. And just going forward, it's 5 months out from the election. It's obviously almost clearly going to be consumed with domestic items, people's choices and things like that. Tell us, Robert, do you think that there is any difference at all between the major parties, National Labour, ACT, Greens, on foreign affairs? Is it likely to play any role at all in election choices, or is there a New Zealand Inc. approach to the international world?
I don't think there's huge substantive differences, Michael. There may be differences of emphasis. I think whoever's in government will continue to believe that New Zealand has a core interest in a rules-based international order. We trade globally, and that won't change whoever's in power. And we also need rules because we can't rely on raw power to get out to assert our interests in the world. We need rules. So I don't think that's going to change. I think there might be a difference of emphasis around things like AUKUS, the enhanced security arrangement between the UK, Australia and the United States. I noticed, though, however, that the number of national spokespeople, including Jerry Brownlee, the Foreign Affairs person, seems to be very, very, lukewarm about AUKUS. So I don't think there's a huge division over AUKUS, but there may be, with national, there may be a greater focus on warming up the relationship with the United States a bit more. But although it's in excellent shape now, the crucial test, of course, is it's not so much changes in New Zealand, it's how the world itself will change. And of course, we have a big election coming up in 2024 in the United States. And that could obviously, if Mr. Trump won the election, or Mr. DeSantis, or whoever's the Republican frontrunner, that might put a little bit of distance between the parties. But at the moment, I can't really see too much separating them.
It's fascinating you mentioned that, because if I was Zelensky, I'd want to win the war before, or if Trump gets re-elected.
Oh, yes.
Wouldn't you?
I think so, but let's be quite clear, there is quite a number of Republicans now who are very supportive of Ukraine. It was interesting when Zelensky was in Tokyo, he paid tribute to the bipartisan support in the United States. He was putting, of course, a good face on it. There's about 10 Republicans, about 10 of the Republican senators who are lukewarm about America supporting Ukraine. They believe that Taiwan takes priority and the struggle against China. Although I think the Biden administration believes the two things are linked. That is, if Mr. Putin's defeated in the Ukraine, America's difficulties with China in relation to Taiwan will diminish, because
yes,
authoritarianism will be seen as declining.
All right, thank you very much, Professor. It's always a pleasure talking to you. That is Professor Robert Patman.
Thank you.
Political scientist, and also one of the leading academics at Otago University's Foreign Policy School as well.